Hey guys, it's another Dialogue Options interviews that strive to elevate the discussion surrounding games and gaming. And the issue of ethics in video games reporting has been a major topic for over a year, going on 18 months now. This has broadened to concerns and confusion surrounding coverage in the mainstream media. So I'm very happy to be here today with President-elect of the SPJ, Lynn Walsh. Lynn, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
Now, since we set this up, something has happened. The whole South by Southwest panel cancellation debacle has happened, and you have been presented in the press as someone connected with an alleged hate group. So I thought I'd start by allowing you a chance to respond to that, because I have never had a panel canceled at a conference in such spectacular fashion.
Yeah, I mean, so just in general, the panel being canceled, the one I was on SafePoint and the other one, obviously disappointing, I think, because one, if there were people that were interested, it seemed like there was a lot of interest. And two, I was really looking forward to continuing the conversation that I had been a part of in Miami with SPJ Airplay, specifically talking about ethics in journalism and sort of bringing that perspective from someone who is a practicing journalist and also has helped rewrite the SPJ Code of Ethics, which is one of the most widely used codes for journalists across the world. So, obviously disappointed as far as, being part of a hate group. I absolutely am not. And, I haven't really been responding on Twitter or on Facebook because to me, it's just not true. So what's the need to kind of engage that, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, it does concern me a little bit because it implies that a reporter covering a story endorses a story. And that's a slippery slope as far as I'm concerned. I mean, I've interviewed Rob Ford twice, our illustrious former mayor. Doesn't mean I condone his opinions. So do you think perhaps there might be required a bit of ethics education in that regard, that just because a reporter talks to somebody doesn't mean they endorse that person?
Oh, I mean, absolutely. I think, the things you have to keep in mind is that because we live in the U.S., because, free society, people can say whatever they want. That said, there are consequences that go with what people say. I'm glad that people are able to say whatever they want. I think that's very important. But yes, I do think you're right. Just because is there, I guess, in education, I don't know if it's for reporters. I think it's kind of a news literacy, if you will, or an online literacy that just, I think, needs to happen with everyone. I don't think it's just gamers. I don't think it's, anyone that's just reporting or is a journalist. It's just how much is a connection? If you like a page on Facebook, does that mean you're endorsing it? If you respond to someone on Twitter, does that mean you're their best friend and you're their supporter, or you are supporting their beliefs? I absolutely don't think so. And I think it would be wrong for people to jump to those conclusions without, one, first contacting both people involved or however many people are involved to get the facts. But two, it can be a stretch, I think, with what the facts that are given.
Yeah, I'm inclined to agree. So let's jump into some of the stuff you probably would have talked about regarding ethics in journalism and best practices for reporters. One is that connection. There's been a lot of talk about reporters being too close to sources, but then that has to be balanced with cultivating a source. So what's fair to expect from the press in that regard, in terms of, I guess, objectivity is what people are going for here?
So I will start by saying I feel like I am one that is very much conservative extreme when it comes to this and relationships with sources. I do take that very seriously just because it's important to me to make sure that line isn't blurred. That said, I know very good reporters that maybe blur that a little bit more than I would be comfortable with. So for me, if you are any way connected to a story that you are reporting on, this might be a little bit different than maybe just sending a tweet, but if you consider yourself someone that is a source of information for whatever industry you're covering, or for a community that you're living in, whether that's a citizen blogger, whether that's just blogging, or whether you're just reporting on Twitter, I think you really should think about your relationship to the people involved in the story you're reporting on. If there is any sort of close relationship, I think at the very least it should be disclosed. That's the very, very least. Now, why should it be disclosed? One, because that eliminates that conflict of interest from the viewers. You're giving them an opportunity to really, you're being transparent. You're giving them an opportunity to see, this is my relationship. So before you read this, you should know that. And I think that's important because we want to make sure we're being as transparent and as clear with our viewers as possible. As far as how to cultivate those sources without kind of blurring that line, there absolutely are ways. You develop, when you work on a story for a long time, you develop close relationships with people. Absolutely. They're going to be texting your cell phone. They're going to be maybe calling you, or you're going to maybe see them out if you're at a restaurant. It's absolutely okay to say hi. It's absolutely okay to maybe, have a drink with them or whatever that might be. But I think you have to make clear, and I do this, hey, everything you still say to me is on the record until we agree that it's off the record. And I have to agree too. It's not just them wanting to be off the record. And if things do start getting blurry, you have that hard conversation. Hey, remember, you sent that email to me. I absolutely can use it. So, you do have to have sort of a legitimate, clear conversation with people sometimes.
Yeah. What about things like you go out for drinks, who pays? Is that an issue?
I do think so. And here's why. If you work on a story, let's say, and, I do investigations, so it's a little bit different than sort of the daily grind, if you will. Mm-hmm. But if I'm working on a story for 2 months, maybe even 6 months, and the source I've been working with might work at the city or might work for the county or whatever it is, and he or she happens to be out at the bar, they buy me a drink, I would say decline it. Because if that story is critical or in favor of that person, someone on either side can say, well, you guys are buddies. That one time at the bar, they bought you a drink. And even if that's not the case, and even if I'm sure that drink did not sway your opinion either way, it's what the public sees. It's their viewpoint. It's what they're perceiving that to be. And then it ruins all that work you did. So why even put yourself in that position? That's just the way I see it.
So it's more this idea of appearance of impropriety is more about not wasting work. It's not so much about it's actually an ethical violation.
So to me, it would be unethical in the fact that it could affect your reporting in the public's perception. But like I said before, I don't think if I were to buy you a beer, that's going to kind of influence your coverage of me or something I'm working on. Even if it's a $10 beer, I don't think people are swayed by $10, $5. But it could be perceived as that. It's kind of just like when studies come out about doctors and them accepting money from pharmaceutical companies or lawyers and their connections, lobbyists and lawmakers. It's kind of all related.
Yeah. This is an issue in games for people who don't know, because it tends to be open bars at events. When you go and cover a studio, they want to take you out to eat, things like this. So this is significant. And photos do show up because the lines blur between marketing event and press event. So it becomes very difficult in the sphere.
And that's interesting in, not being a person who reports in the gaming industry or is a gaming blogger or reports on the industry at all. That is a little different, I think.
Okay.
So let's say if there is a gaming designer or something, or a gaming programmer, a company that invites a bunch of gaming journalists, let's say, gaming bloggers, people covering the industry. If it's all press and it wasn't a special invitation to you, I think that is a little bit different.
Okay, that's interesting.
But I also would say, if you do end up doing a review and that's the night that you maybe saw that game or were able to play that game, I would be a proponent of saying, just FYI, I was able to review this game because they sent it in the mail to me or something.
Yeah, that's standard.
Just because it's transparent, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
But again, if it's open to everyone, I don't know. I think that's a little, I would think as a member of the public, I would have a harder time being critical of you or someone else doing that, because that is kind of part of the job. If you don't go to that, you are potentially missing out on stories. That's kind of a networking event, if you will.
Yeah, and I'm glad you make that distinction because it is sort of, it's almost like, the Washington Press Corps, only not very important, that we're all sort of corralled in together, and we are in there for like 6 hours at a time sometimes, so they provide food, and
Mhm.
that's become an issue. So thanks for clearing that up. I want to get in because you touched on it briefly with your own work. You're an investigator. You're not sort of news desk. I'm a game, writer slash critic. These are beats. And
Mhm.
one of the things that you brought up at SPJ is the idea of a beat at Airplay. And people didn't seem to quite understand what that meant. So I wanted to unpack that a bit, the difference between having a specialty and being on general news desk and what that does to your coverage. So I'd love to hear from you on that.
Yeah, and kind of stop me if I'm going in a different direction you would want to go in. But so I think in general, beats tend to be something like in a local newsroom. So like your local TV station, you have daily journalists who they could literally be covering a really terrible crash one day. They could be covering city council the next. They could be covering a sporting event the next. I mean, they are kind of all over the place. But then you do have people that sort of specialize in certain industries. Education is a good example. That's kind of one that's primary. Military is another one. Sports is another one that's sort of very much you're normally just kind of a sports reporter. Investigations is another one. So in gaming, that would be, you're a gaming journalist. You cover the gaming industry. So if there is breaking news like a school shooting, that might not be something that you're going to cover at all. And not that you don't care, but that's just not what your concern is professionally. And I'm trying to think what else about beats. So that's kind of a very sort of high level.
I think that ties into the idea of hard news versus niche interest, which is another thing that I've come up against, that people are like, why doesn't the mainstream press cover games? And it's just like, well, it's very interesting to us, but it doesn't meet the burden of hard news. And I think I would like to talk to you about what
Yeah.
makes a story newsworthy.
Okay. And I think before I talk about that, I do want to kind of bring up kind of a perfect example.
Okay.
So there are things that are very important to me. I am very much like this person that one is like a data nerd. I love data. I love government data. I love transparency when it comes to that. I also get really upset when the government doesn't release public information that I think should be public and belongs to everyone.
Mm-hmm.
Those are issues, though, that get so sort of convoluted for the everyday person that we don't even necessarily air those on our station. But what I do is I put it up on the web because there is an audience for that. So that's just kind of an example that happens to me every day and is kind of comparable, I think, to gaming, where they're really important issues to me. And not that they're not important to my newsroom, but to the general public, it doesn't rise to that level. And they're not following it as closely as I am. So it would sometimes be over their head.
And you can't
Um,
unpack it in 90 seconds.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
that is part of, whether you like it or not, part of television news is telling things quickly, succinctly, and being clear.
Yeah.
Now, that said, is it always the best way? Absolutely not. And I think that's another kind of conversation to be had. And, I think we're still figuring that out as media changes. But as far as what makes something newsworthy, I mean, for myself and in newsrooms I've been in, I think a lot of times what people look at is how many people are affected and what's the impact. I mean, those are two really big things. And so, in the gaming community, people could come back and say, there are a lot of gamers. There are a lot of people that play video games, that play these different games, that are involved, invested, and want to know more about this.
Mm-hmm.
You know what? You're absolutely right. But guess what? There are a lot of people also that are involved with the stock market, and we barely cover that.
Right.
And I mean, that's something that is very important too. So I think you have to keep in mind, it's like as far as when you look at a local TV station, I guess, it's what's affecting that local community today or tomorrow. And if something going on in the gaming industry isn't affecting someone like my mother, your mother, or, anyone else in their children or, their drive to work, that's traditionally not going to be something that they necessarily cover. Um, I think also, TV, if you are specifically talking, TV news, sort of that mainstream, it's a visual medium and people have to keep that in mind too. So when people say things like, oh, it's always this fire, it's always that. Well, because if we don't have video, it's harder to tell the story. It doesn't mean that we don't, because there are creative ways to do it, but that is something that does that people do consider. The other thing also is who's going to talk to us and who's going to talk to us on camera. Again, because that's the visual medium. That's the medium that we're serving. Versus if someone's just going to talk on the phone, that's good and we can do that. But it's really better to get that person to be on camera so that they can see them.
So an anonymous source, the way so much on the internet runs on nowadays, especially issues of taste or popularity, it tends to come through these message boards with a bunch of anonymous accounts. Would you say that significantly decreases the likelihood that the mainstream press is going to jump on this because there's no face, there's no name, there's no W5H?
Well, I will say if someone is unwilling to reveal their identity to a reporter, it is going to be, it's very slim chance that what they have to say is going to make it on TV specifically. I mean, and look, there are always exceptions because I know saying that there's going to be an example there. But if you really are paying attention to journalism ethics and trying to be a responsible journalist, I would say very, very rarely. And this is, again, not that you're not revealing it to the public, but that you're not even willing to reveal it to the person reporting.
That's right.
And I think that does come into play sometimes when you're covering movements that sort of are like, there's no one person representing them. Something like the gaming community or, there are others as well. So yes, I think it does come into play. But that said, if you're willing to go on the record with the reporter, there are some times that we will use an anonymous source and not reveal it to the public.
Right.
But those are very extreme cases. And honestly, it's where, if I reveal this person's name, are they going to be in physical danger? Is there something that is very serious that could happen to them or their family? And those cases are very rare. I mean, and, again, that's a different conversation, I think, about how often anonymous sources are used. And yes, I agree with people. Sometimes they are abused, sometimes with being overused. But generally, those are the standards that I know I try to stick to and that journalists do try to stick to and should.
Now, it's that try. I mean, I know my entire career, when I worked in music, when I worked in hard news, it's weird to realize I used to cover child murders and now I'm writing about video games. But the same principles apply. And it's always been a point of interest to me that everybody seems to have a slightly different interpretation of what appear to be exceptionally clear guidelines. And the question I've gotten asked a lot is, why is there no enforcement? Why is it sort of everybody's, will do your best? Like, why is the system structured that way? That's a question I get a lot. So I'd like to turn it over to you.
Yeah, so this came up a little bit earlier in the week when I was kind of talking about that. And, while SPJ does have a code of ethics and other journalism organizations do have a code of ethics, they are guidelines. If someone violates it, if you will, no one gets kicked out of being a journalist or out of the profession. That said, SPJ absolutely, and so have other news organizations, taken stance on reporting that may be questionable, that they think is maybe inappropriate or violates that code to an extreme, to say, look, this is not what we want to continue. Sort of trying to basically protect the profession, if you will. So I guess why is it important that it's not enforced? To me, I think especially, 10 years ago, maybe asking this, I think people maybe would have had a different answer or it would have been harder to answer. But now, I mean, look at everyone who's really doing great journalism that is not a journalist or maybe doesn't consider themselves a journalist. I mean, we're in a day and age, which I think is great, where a tweet can be just as powerful, 140 characters, just as powerful as a New York Times article. I mean, that potential is there. And since we are there now, what if we did have sort of this licensing, if you will, and that person wasn't licensed? Do they lose that credibility? Is that even possible then, even though their information is powerful? Or do people end up losing access? I mean, that then applies to public information laws and the Freedom of Information Act. What if the government was like, well, you have to be a licensed journalist now to get this information? That would be awful. That would be terrible. So to me, coming from that perspective, and look, I don't know if those things would happen, but I think those would be some of the cons to why setting something up like that would maybe be hurtful just to a free society and freedom of speech and freedom of the press.
Oh, I think you're right, because I've encountered this idea that I'm not a real journalist, and for various smear tactics, and it's like my response has always been, well, but was my story factual? Did I cover the facts? And that brings me to another thing I wanted to talk to you about, the I'm just a blogger defense. We get this a lot in games, that somebody messes up. They get a fact wrong. They swap out opinion and state it as fact, and then they say, I'm just a blogger, I'm not a journalist, get off my back. How do you respond to this?
I think it's important for people who maybe find themselves in those situations to really ask themselves, if I'm publishing online, do I want to be taken seriously? Do I want to be thought of as a credible source? Do I want to be a source of information for the community I'm covering, in this case, gaming? If the answer is yes, then it should not matter if you're a blogger, a journalist, a reporter, or whatever your title is that you want to use. Mm-hmm. You should try to be as ethical as possible, because if you want to serve the public or serve that community or serve, that website or whatever, the people who come there, whatever that is, that should be important to you, because it's going to affect your credibility. And at the end of the day, you talk about licensing, but at the end of the day, credibility is one of the only things that journalists really have to stand on. And if you lose that, good luck moving forward, really. And I think that was another point that was brought up as far as this licensing. Yeah, we may not license people per se, but if you have a track record of being unethical or not being credible, you're going to have a hard time finding a job. I think people want credible, reliable, accurate reporters and ethical reporters. So I would say, well, yes, you may just consider yourself that way. What do you strive to do? And if you are publishing online, I think you'd want to do it responsibly, because there is a lot of impact that can have on people's lives that don't just affect you.
Now, about that impact, I want to close with asking you, if somebody does have a bad experience with a reporter or a media outlet, they do get misquoted, they feel like they've been misrepresented, what do they do?
I think you absolutely can reach out to the media. Mm-hmm. And I talked about this a little bit at SPJ Airplay, and didn't get a chance to kind of really talk about it more. So definitely contact them. I think, though, the way you contact someone, and this is just in general, and I think kind of just in life, being civil is going to get you so much further than attacking or being aggressive or, harassing or whatever you might, being civil with the person. Calling them too, sometimes a phone call is so much better than trying to tweet to them or tell them what you're trying to express in an email even. I've gotten emails from people after a story, and I'm like, can we talk? Because I'm actually unclear. Let's see. I want to see exactly what maybe your issue is, or what the concern you're trying to voice, so that I can do my best to see what we can do to maybe correct the situation or do a follow-up story. But I think that civility is key, because if someone comes to me and is ranting and like yelling on the phone, I'm already kind of like, whoa, what's going on? As I think a lot of people are, mm-hmm. Because it's hard to have a conversation and I guess get to the same point of understanding as to what needs to be done to further it.
So you'd say, in your opinion, one phone call from a person who's calm and civil is more effective in getting a story corrected than 500 tweets that originated from a single message board.
I do think so. And I think the other thing you have to keep in mind is that, so let's say if it shows up online, mm-hmm. and it might have someone's name, but they may not necessarily have been the person that was gathering the information in some cases. Sometimes there might be like a web producer or an online, web writer. So, and I know this sounds silly, but keep those in mind. It may take for them to contact the reporter, for them to contact their boss or their editor to see, okay, what can we do? Because a lot of times a reporter at a lot of news organizations can't just go online and change a script without approval, because we try not to do that, to remain to keep what we published very much alive, even though the internet is ever changing. And again, if it doesn't happen, yeah, go up the chain, talk to someone. But I do think in most cases, if you do call people or get a hold of who you originally talked to, or get a hold of someone, they're going to want to fix it, because when anyone gets that call in a newsroom, you just feel terrible. Yeah. You really do. As a journalist, it honestly breaks my heart if anyone's calling and thinks that the coverage was not accurate or fair, because I genuinely strive for that. And I think most journalists really do.
Now, what's the end result, as we saw in this South by Southwest thing? Someone wasn't satisfied with an outcome internally. So they went to a competing outlet and created sort of a press war. What's the outcome of that in terms of accuracy in reporting when you start playing organizations off each other?
I mean, look, the reality is it happens.
Yeah.
I have sources that come to me all the time, and they say, if you don't go with this today, I'm going next door. And you have to, and it's hard sometimes. And sometimes reporters get mad when I say, you know what, we're not going with it yet. We just don't have enough confirmed. And sometimes we do get beat. It happens. But I'd rather be accurate and know what's going on than put on someone's allegations that we haven't been able to prove or find documents themselves. So one, I think it does happen. I think two, the best thing to do is, again, contact both news organizations and share what your thoughts are about it. Send an email. Also, let's say you are maybe a blogger that might be in the mix of maybe two bigger publications, which I think some of this is kind of what's happened a little bit. Publish your own blog and put out the facts. Sometimes showing emails, assuming they were on the record, which I hope that anytime anyone's emailing, they know it's on the record. But showing that kind of and documenting, sometimes those stories can really be the most powerful. And I think journalists in general don't do enough of showing how the story came together, where the information came from, and who was involved.
Yeah, I mean, this developing story paradigm and the fact that everything has to be so fast, I think I was in some situations when I did hard news that were like, oh my God, there's no right answer here. And you're going to be wrong somehow just as much as you're going to be right. That developing story angle, knowing you're going to make mistakes, you're going to be misled. Sometimes people outright lie exceptionally convincingly. What do you want the public to know about being a reporter in that space?
So I think in breaking news situations, especially when information maybe is coming in so quickly, or people are live, so whether that's on TV or it's on social media, live tweeting, all of that, I think there are a couple things reporters can do to kind of make the public aware. Just doing sort of a tweet before you're out there or something. Hey, I'm going to be live tweeting. The scene is ever changing. I'm going to be tweeting what I'm seeing and hearing, and I will correct things as I maybe hear that they might be incorrect. And I think just doing that, letting the public see into your kind of thought process, I think helps that situation. I think also the public has to be aware and pay attention to that. That it's just let's say you were involved in a car accident personally, like a member of the public is. When you're on a scene, you might not know. You might have thought it was one car. It turns out it was two cars. You might not have thought a pedestrian was hit. Oh, a pedestrian is hit. So, I think the public also has to be aware in these situations. You're not getting all the information at once. You're getting bits and pieces. We still, though, have a responsibility to make sure we are being as protective with that information in the sense of making sure we're doing some double checking, fact checking. And also the public can also keep in mind, sometimes we just don't know. We don't know because people aren't telling us. And I think journalists on that same angle can say, we don't know. It's okay to say we don't know when you genuinely do not know. And I think the public respects that. I actually was just talking to a family member the other night who was talking about the debate a couple days ago. And a reporter had said, I'm sorry, I had this incorrect. You are absolutely right. And that family member was like, I really respected that because it was just honest. And people sometimes, we're not perfect. We try to do it the best we can, but we're not perfect.
Yeah, I think a big issue in gaming, and I know you have to go, so I will wrap this up. A big issue in gaming is the idea that mistakes in those sort of early, everything's moving fast, are deliberate lies. Now, in your experience, how often do people outright lie in these situations versus mistaken? And I don't need a number, just is
Right.
it more likely someone is to be mistaken, or are people that dishonest?
I mean, I think there are cases where if you are on a scene, somebody could be outright lying to you.
Mhm.
They might have an agenda and you have no idea about it. So look, that happens. But I think as journalists, if we put it on kind of like the reporter or someone reporting something, I have yet to meet a journalist who genuinely is just trying to lie and publish lies online. Um, I don't think anyone in, again, this is maybe something that's just me thinking, the world is all like rainbows and butterflies. But I do genuinely think reporters are not trying to publish lies. And if they believe someone is lying, they'll call up. I mean, this happens out in the field. They're like, hey, someone told us this. It doesn't feel right though, and here's why.
Mhm.
And we won't go with it. We'll hold it. We might have interviewed them, but we won't go with it right away. And I think that also goes to a reporter's responsibility in these breaking news situations. If something doesn't feel right, make another phone call, do a little searching online, background check whoever might be saying that to see if they have an agenda.
Lynn, thanks very much. We've been talking
Yeah,
to
thank you.
Lynn Walsh, president-elect of the Society for Professional Journalists, about the dreaded ethics in journalism topic. Lynn, thanks so much for your time and your candor. I think it's been very informative, both for gamers and game journalists alike.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Glad to be on. Have a good weekend.